Welcome to this topic of the Spirent TestCenter course on routing overview. This routing topic overview should also be viewed by mpls users too, because it covers the basic setup parameters for all emulated devices. We will cover in this topic various things that are depicted as in the bullets here. In this topic, we will cover things such as a technology selector, configuring devices and device parameters, the different wizards that are available for setting up routes and LSAs, how to manipulate the interfaces of the devices, how to view routes received by the devices, configure route attributes, global options, and other routing protocol results. The technology selector enables you to filter out or enable routing and MPLS protocols that you desire. So when filtered out, none of the protocols will appear either in the test setup windows, the test wizard windows, the command sequencer windows, or the results. But when enabled, you will view the parameters for all those in the various ways that they apply. So in order to enable routing your MPLS simulation, you first have to create one or more devices across one or more ports. So you'll select either at the all devices level where you can add devices to all the ports, or underneath an individual port where you can add one or more devices underneath a specific port. Once you select the all devices or devices setup grid, there's an add button, and from there you can access the create devices wizard. You can add devices using the wizard, or you can add them manually by just adding one device at a time per port, or you can use any combination of the two. The device wizard has various screens that it will walk you through, starting with the screen to select which port you want to add the devices to at the time. You can use multiple device wizard sessions to add multiple routers to different ports, especially if they have different attributes, because a single device wizard will allow you to add multiple devices across one or more ports, but they all have the same attributes. So for instance, they either all are VLAN tagged, or they all have BGP enabled, or something like that. In other words, they're all fairly similar. The second device wizard screen is the select protocols. So in this example, we're looking at enabling one or more routing or MPLS protocols to one or more ports, and through a single wizard session you can actually enable multiple protocols at a time. You could also select for certain protocols such as BGP that when you're done adding and configuring your BGP parameters in the device wizard, it will automatically launch the generate routes wizard where you can add routes to it then. The third device wizard screen allows you to select the encapsulation. Most of the time you're using Ethernet ports, so it's a decision of whether or not you want to add a VLAN header or not. And we'll look more at adding one or more VLAN headers on the following screens. But notice as the slide depicts here that once you check the VLAN headers box and add one or more headers, that a configure VLAN screen will also appear in the steps. In addition to that, you can enable IP version 4 or IP version 6 or even dual stack if the protocol supports that. So if you've enabled VLANs, the configured VLAN screen will appear next, and from there you can add one or more VLANs to one or more devices. So in this case it depicts that I actually added two VLANs, which is also referred to as Q and Q. And so you'll notice that the top VLAN number 1 would actually be associated with the outer VLAN tag, sometimes referred to as the S tag or service provider tag, whereas VLAN 2 would actually refer to the customer tag, or C tag as it's often referred to. And you can set up the things such as what the VLAN IDs are going to be, what the type IDs, and be careful, especially if you're doing Q and Q, that the VLAN 1 type ID is set correctly, because Spirent TestCenter will actually default the value to 8100, which is typically what the value would be for a C tag instead. This slide provides more details on configuring VLANs in the device wizard. VLAN 1 is always the first or top tag. It is the only tag if only one VLAN is configured. If only one VLAN is configured, the type ID field must be hex 8100 as per the IEEE 802.1q. Spirent TestCenter only counts it as a VLAN frame by default when its type ID is hex 8100, but that can be changed in the port settings. The type ID field identifies the frame as 802.1q VLAN tagged. The S tag type ID is vendor proprietary. There's a unique value depending on the implementation. It could be hex 9100, 9200, 8888, etc. Whereas the C tag, the type ID field, is always 8100 as I previously described. You could also set the VLAN tag priority, or what's referred to as P bits. And for the S tag, the CFI, Canonical Format Identifier bit, has redefined to be used as a discard eligible bit, similar to the frame relay implementation of DE. The next Device Wizard screen allows you to configure the devices, such as their MAC addresses that will be used, the IP addresses, default gateway, and if you're applying either multiple devices per port or multiple devices across ports, you have to remember the steps and make sure that you don't duplicate values and you step correctly, for instance, on the correct subnet values for IP. So for instance, in this example, if we have an IPv4 prefix length of 24, and we expect there to be a different /24 prefix on each port, then we want to check the step per port and set it to 0010. Another thing I'll point out here is when we create devices that are going to emulate routing protocols, that you can only select one device per block. The next Create Device Wizard screen will depend on which protocols you have enabled. In this case, BGP is enabled, so it allows us to configure the BGP parameters for the devices in the tests. It allows the parameters to be a little bit different using the steps across ports or across devices on a single port in the test. It also gives you access to many of the configurable parameters for the protocol, in this case for BGP, the AS values that you're going to set up, whether or not you're enabling authentication, graceful restart, or BFD. The last Device Wizard screen gives you a preview of what you've created. So you can see, especially for large-scale tests, how all the MAC addresses and IP addresses and gateways were applied using the steps within and across ports, and some of the protocol parameters are exposed here too. Each protocol has a special wizard for applying routes or LSPs. So in this case, we're looking at the BGP route generator, where you can set up a number of routes to create across multiple ports, what prefixes you want to assign to them, how you want to distribute those prefixes, and some of the attributes of those routes as well. We'll cover each protocol's route or LSA generator in separate presentations. So once you've created your devices using the Device Wizard, you can view and manipulate them from the All Devices or Individual Device Setup grids. And you'll notice that the first tab is the Emulated Device Interface, which actually has the generic properties of each device, such as their router ID, their encapsulation, their MAC address, their IP address, their default gateway. So the idea is that no matter which protocol that they're emulating, all these parameters are going to be the same. And you can edit the encapsulation of those. So notice from the edit interface you can view and or change whether or not you have the VLAN headers, whether or not you're routing over GRI, and other upper layer protocol parameters. Each protocol has a separate tab where you can configure that protocol's parameters separately. Of course, these are the parameters that are responsible for bringing up the router state. So there's a router state column. So for instance, when you bring up a BGP session, what you're going to advertise is your AS, what AS you're willing to peer with, what you're going to advertise as your keep alive time? Are you going to try to use authentication? So these have little to do with the actual routes that you're going to send, but rather how you're going to bring up the session in the first place. You can also enable to view receive routes from the DUT. So as you can see in the setup grid where you can enable the view routes, and then once you do that you can bring up your session and you can advertise routes. The system will advertise routes to you, and you can go underneath the protocol and view the routes that were received from the DUT. Depending on the protocol, the routes that you advertise will have metrics or attributes. In this case, we're looking at a BGP routes window, and in there you'll notice all the different BGP attributes are exposed, where you can set up, for instance, the origin, AS path, aggregator. Depending on if you're emulating, let's say, route reflectors, you can set up originator IDs, cluster IDs. You could also set up a route category. So the route category can be either undefined, primary, secondary, or unique. So when you use a route generator, for instance, and you set up a percentage of routes to duplicate, then it will automatically tag the routes as either primary or secondary. And then routes tagged as secondary can be filtered out of places such as a traffic wizard, and or the route categories can be selected as an attribute for withdrawing routes or re-advertising routes as well. So it's sort of a way of grouping routes that you can manipulate them by category. Routing protocols also have global options. So in other words, they're test level and it applies to all the emulated routers and devices in the test. So in this case, again, we have a BGP example, and so we have our BGP global options, which really is a throttling mechanism to determine how many routes we're going to allow our routers to advertise per test, how fast we're going to advertise them, and some other parameters that globally you want to set for the test. And then routing protocol results. So this picture depicts the results browser and how you can change the results view and go to the routing and mpls results, and then each protocol has a separate results view that you can view the statistics associated with that specific routing protocol. Thank you for taking the time for viewing this topic on routing overview.